From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Today, we are not facing the rise of anything like Nazism, but we are facing the spread of what's sometimes called ultra-nationalist, reactionary international, trumpeted openly by its advocates, including Steve Bannon, the impresario of the movement.
Today, Noam Chomsky for the Hour on how ultra-nationalist movements across the globe threaten democracy, the arrest of WikiLeaks' Julian Assange, the Green New Deal, and Russian meddling in the 2016 election.
As far as Trump collusion with the Russians, that was never going to amount to anything more than minor corruption. Maybe building a Trump hotel in Red Square or something like that, but nothing of any significance. The Democrats invested everything in this issue. Well, turned out there was nothing much there. They gave Trump a huge gift. In fact, they may have handed him the next election.
Noam Chomsky for the Hour. All that and more coming up. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today, a Democracy Now! Special, an hour with Noam Chomsky, the world-renowned dissident and father of modern linguistics. In April, Noam Chomsky visited his hometown of Boston, where he was a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for more than half a century. He now teaches at the University of Arizona, Tucson. Over 700 people packed into the Old South Church to hear him speak. Later in the broadcast, we'll air my on-stage interview with him. But first, we turn to his speech.
If you'll indulge me, I'd like to start with a brief reminiscence of a period which is eerily similar to today in many unpleasant respects. I'm thinking of exactly 80 years ago, almost to the day, happened to be the moment of the first article that I remember having written on political issues. Easy to date, it was right after the fall of Barcelona in February 1939. The article was about what seemed to be the inexorable spread of fascism over the world. In 1938, Austria had been annexed by Nazi Germany. A few months later, Czechoslovakia was betrayed, placed in the hands of the Nazis at the Munich conference. In Spain, one city after another was falling to Franco's forces. February 1939, Barcelona fell. That was the end of the Spanish Republic. The remarkable popular revolution, anarchist revolution of 1936, 37, 38 had already been crushed by force. It looked as if fascism was going to spread without end. It's not exactly what's happening today, but if we can borrow Mark Twain's famous phrase, history doesn't repeat, but sometimes rhymes. Too many similarities to overlook. When Barcelona fell, there was a huge flood of refugees from Spain. Most went to Mexico, about 40,000. Some went to New York City, established anarchist offices in Union Square, secondhand bookstores down 4th Avenue. That's where I got my early political education, roaming around that area. That's 80 years ago. Now it's today. We didn't know at the time, but the U.S. government was also beginning to think about how the spread of fascism might be virtually unstoppable. They didn't view it with the same alarm that I did as a 10-year-old. We now know that the attitude of the State Department was rather mixed regarding what the significance of the Nazi movement was. Actually, there was a consul in Berlin, U.S. consul in Berlin, who was sending back pretty mixed comments about the Nazis, suggesting maybe they're not as bad as everyone says. He stayed there until Pearl Harbor Day, when he was withdrawn. Famous diplomat named George Kennan. Not a bad indication of the mixed attitude towards these developments. It turns out, couldn't have known it at the time, but shortly after this, 1939, the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations began to carry out planning about the post-war world. What would the post-war world look like? And in the early years, right about that time, next few years, they assumed that the post-war world would be divided between a German-controlled world, Nazi-controlled world, most of Eurasia, and a US-controlled world, which would include the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, which the US would take over, parts of the Far East, and that would be the shape of the post-war world. Those views, we now know, were maintained until the Russians turned the tide. Stalingrad, 1942, the huge tank battle at Kursk a little later, made it pretty clear that the Russians would defeat the Nazis. The planning changed, picture of the post-war world changed, went on to what we've seen for the last period since that time. Well, that was 80 years ago. Today, we are not facing the rise of anything like Nazism, but we are facing the spread of what's sometimes called ultranationalist, reactionary international, trumpeted openly by its advocates, including Steve Bannon, the impresario of the movement, just had a victory yesterday. The Netanyahu election in Israel solidified the reactionary alliance that's being established, all of this under the U.S. aegis, run by the triumvirate, Trump, Pompeo, Bolton, triumvirate. Could borrow a phrase from George W. Bush to describe them, but out of politeness I won't. The Middle East alliance consists of the extreme reactionary states of the region, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt under the most brutal dictatorship of its history, Israel right at the center of it, confronting Iran, severe threats that we're facing. In Latin America, the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil put in power the most extreme, most outrageous of the right-wing ultranationalists who are now plaguing the hemisphere. Yesterday, Lenin Moreno of Ecuador took a strong step towards joining the far-right alliance by expelling Julian Assange from the embassies, picked up quickly by the U.S., will face a very dangerous future unless there's a significant popular protest. Mexico and is one of the rare exceptions in Latin America to these developments. This has happened in Western Europe. The right-wing parties are growing, some of them very frightening in character. There is a counter-development. Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece, very significant, important individual, along with Bernie Sanders, have urged the formation of a progressive international to counter the right-wing international that's developing. At the level of states, the balance looks overwhelmingly in the wrong direction. But states aren't the only entities. At the level of people, it's quite different. And that could make the difference. That means a need to protect the functioning democracies, to enhance them, to make use of the opportunities they provide for the kinds of activism that have led to significant progress in the past, could save us in the future. I want to make a couple of remarks below about the severe difficulty of maintaining and instituting democracy, the powerful forces that have always opposed it, the achievements of somehow salvaging and enhancing it, and the significance of that for the future. But first, a couple of words about the challenges that we face, which you heard enough about already and you all know about. I don't have to go into them in detail. To describe these challenges as extremely severe would be an error. The phrase does not capture the enormity of the kinds of challenges that lie ahead, and any serious discussion of the future of humanity must begin by recognizing a critical fact that the human species is now facing a question that has never before arisen in human history, a question that has to be answered quickly. Will human society survive for long? Well, as you all know, for 70 years we've been living under the shadow of nuclear war. Those who've looked at the record can only be amazed that we've survived this far. Time after time, it's come extremely close to terminal disaster, even minutes away. It's kind of a miracle that we've survived. Miracles don't go on forever. This has to be terminated, and quickly. The recent nuclear posture review of the Trump administration dramatically increases the threat of conflagration, which would in fact be terminal for the species. We may remember that this nuclear posture review was sponsored by Jim Mattis, who was regarded as too civilized to be retained in the administration. Gives you a sense of what can be tolerated in the Trump, Pompeo, Bolton world. Well, there were three major arms treaties. The ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces, the New START Treaty. The U.S. pulled out of the ABM Treaty in 2002, and anyone who believes that anti-ballistic missiles are defensive weapons is deluded about the nature of these systems. The U.S. has just pulled out of the INF Treaty, established by Gorbachev and Reagan in 1987, which sharply reduced the threat of war in Europe, which would very quickly spread. The background of that signing of that treaty was the demonstrations that you just saw depicted on the film. Massive public demonstrations were the background for leading to a treaty that made a very significant difference. It's worth remembering that, and many other cases where significant popular activism has made a huge difference. The lessons are too obvious to enumerate. Well, the Trump administration has just withdrawn from the INF Treaty. The Russians withdrew right afterwards. If you take a close look, you find that each side has a kind of a credible case saying that the opponent has not lived up to the treaty. For those who want a picture of how the Russians might look at it, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the major journal on arms control issues, had a lead article a couple of weeks ago by Theodore Postal pointing out how dangerous the U.S. installations of anti-ballistic missiles on the Russian border, how dangerous they are and can be perceived to be by the Russians. Notice on the Russian border, tensions are mounting on the Russian border. Both sides are carrying out provocative actions. We should, in a rational world, what would happen would be negotiations between the two sides with independent experts to evaluate the charges that each is making against the other to lead to a resolution of these charges, restore the treaty. That's a rational world, but it's unfortunately not the world we're living in. No efforts at all have been made in this direction, and they won't be unless there is significant pressure. Well, that leaves the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty has already been designated by the figure in charge, who has modestly described himself as the greatest president in American history. He gave it the usual designation of anything that was done by his predecessors, the worst treaty that ever happened in human history. We've got to get rid of it. If, in fact, this comes up for renewal right after the next election, and a lot is at stake. A lot is at stake in whether that treaty will be renewed. It has succeeded in very significantly reducing the number of nuclear weapons to a level way above what they ought to be, but way below what they were before, and it could go on. Well, meanwhile, global warming proceeds on its inexorable course. During this millennium, every single year, with one exception, has been hotter than the last one. There are recent scientific papers, James Hansen and others, which indicate that the pace of global warming, which has been increasing since about 1980, may be sharply escalating and may be moving from linear growth to exponential growth, which means doubling every couple of decades. We're already approaching the conditions of 125,000 years ago when the sea level was about roughly 25 feet higher than it is today. With the melting, the rapid melting of the Antarctic huge ice fields, that point might be reached. The consequences of that are almost unimaginable. I mean, I won't even try to depict them, but you can figure out quickly what that means. Well, meanwhile, while this is going on, you regularly read in the press euphoric accounts of how the United States is advancing in fossil fuel production. It's now surpassed Saudi Arabia. We're in the lead of fossil fuel production. The big banks, JP Morgan Chase and others, are pouring money into new investments in fossil fuels, including the most dangerous, like Canadian tar sands. This is all presented with great euphoria, excitement. We're now reaching energy independence. We can control the world, determine the use of fossil fuels in the world. Barely a word on what the meaning of this is, which is quite obvious. It's not that the reporters, commentators don't know about it. that the CEO of the banks don't know about it. Of course they do. But these are kind of institutional pressures that just are extremely hard to extricate themselves from. You can put yourself in try to put yourself in the position of say the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, the biggest bank, which is spending large sums in investment in fossil fuels. He certainly knows everything that you all know about global warming. It's no secret. But what are the choices? It basically has two choices. One choice is to do exactly what he's doing. The other choice is to resign and be replaced by somebody else who'll do exactly what he's doing. It's not an individual problem. It's an institutional problem, which can be met, but only under tremendous public pressure. And we've recently seen very dramatically how the solution can be reached. A group of young people, Sunrise Movement, organized, got to the point of sitting in congressional offices, aroused some interest from the new progressive figures who were able to make it to Congress under a lot of popular pressure. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, joined by Ed Markey, actually placed the Green New Deal on the agenda. That's a remarkable achievement. Of course, it gets hostile attacks from everywhere. It doesn't matter. It's a couple of years ago, it was unimaginable that it would be discussed. As a result of the activism of these group of young people, it's now right in the center of the agenda. It's got to be implemented in one form or another. It's essential for survival, maybe not in exactly that form, but some modification of it. Tremendous change achieved by the commitment of a small group of young people. That tells you the kind of thing that can be done. Meanwhile, the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists last January was set at 2 minutes to midnight. That's the closest it's been to terminal disaster since 1947. The announcement of the settlement of the setting mentioned the two major familiar threats. The threat of nuclear war, which is increasing, threat of global warming, which is increasing further, and it added a third for the first time, the undermining of democracy. That's the third threat, along with global warming and nuclear war. And that was quite appropriate, because functioning democracy offers the only hope of overcoming these threats. They're not going to be dealt with by major institutions, state or private, acting without massive public pressure, which means that the means of democratic functioning have to be kept alive, used the way the Sunshine Movement did it, the way the great mass demonstration in the early 80s did it, and the way we continue today.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking at the Old South Church in Boston in April. When we return from break, I speak to him about the arrest of Julian Assange, the Israeli elections, the war in Yemen, and more.
For the rock and roll, and Dr. John for the Jack on the moon, Little Richard for a Saturday night, James Brown if you're feeling out of sight, Willie Nelson if you're feeling low, Aretha Franklin if you need some soul, play 'em loud, but if you're quiet and you're moving, baby, no, Chomsky is the soul revolution.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We return to Noam Chomsky's appearance at the Old South Church in Boston on April 11th. After he addressed the crowd of over 700 people, I had a chance to conduct an on-stage interview with the world-renowned dissident and father of modern linguistics. I began by asking him about WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange, who'd been arrested earlier in the day. He had been taken out by British authorities of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he had political asylum for almost 7 years.
Well, the Assange arrest is scandalous in several respects. One of them is just the effort of governments, and it's not just the U.S. government. The British are cooperating. Ecuador, of course, is now cooperating. Sweden before had cooperated. The efforts to silence a journalist who was producing materials that people in power didn't want the rascal multitude to know about. Okay? That's basically what happened. WikiLeaks was producing things that people ought to know about those in power. People in power don't like that, so therefore we have to silence it, okay? This is the kind of thing, the kind of scandal that takes place, unfortunately, over and over. To take another example, right next door to Ecuador, in Brazil, where the developments that have gone on are extremely important. This is the most important country in Latin America, one of the most important in the world. Under the Lula government, early in this millennium, Brazil was maybe the most respected country in the world. It was the voice for the global South under the leadership of Lula da Silva. Notice what happened. There was a coup, soft coup, to eliminate the nefarious effects of the Labor Party, the Workers' Party. These are described by the World Bank, not me, the World Bank, as the golden decade in Brazil's history, with radical reduction of poverty, massive extension of inclusion of marginalized populations, large parts of the population, Afro-Brazilian, indigenous, who were brought into the society, a sense of dignity and hope for the population. That couldn't be tolerated. After Lula's, after he left office, kind of a soft coup take place. I won't go through the details, but the last move, last September, was to take the Lula da Silva, the most popular figure in Brazil, who was almost certain to win the forthcoming election, put him in jail, solitary confinement, essentially a death sentence, 25 years in jail, banned from reading press or books, and crucially barred from making a public statement, unlike mass murderers on death row. This in order to silence the person who was likely to win the election. He's the most important political prisoner in the world. Do you hear anything about it? Well, Assange is a similar case. We've got to silence this voice. You go back to history, some of you may recall when Mussolini's fascist government put Antonio Gramsci in jail. They said, the prosecutor said, we have to silence this voice for 20 years. Can't let it speak. That's Assange. That's Lula. There are other cases. That's one scandal. The other scandal is just the extraterritorial reach of the United States, which is shocking. I mean, why should the United States, why should no other state could possibly do it, but why should the United States have the power to control what others are doing elsewhere in the world? I mean, it's an outlandish situation. It goes on all the time. We never even notice it. At least there's no comment on it. You can ask yourself, why is this accepted? So in this case, why is it acceptable for the United States to have the power to even begin to give even a proposal to extradite somebody whose crime is to expose to the public materials that people in power don't want them to see? That's basically what's happening.
Noam, what about what's happened in Israel? Prime Minister Netanyahu winning a record fifth term. Right before the election, he announces that he will annex illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Last month, Trump officially recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
Well, first of all, if Benny Gantz had been elected instead of Netanyahu, the difference would not be very great. The difference between the two candidates is not substantial in terms of policy. Netanyahu, here's another example of the extraterritorial reach of the United States. Netanyahu is somewhat more extreme. The United States desperately wanted him to be elected, and the Trump administration has been giving gift after gift to Netanyahu to try to get him elected. It was enough to carry him over the roughly 50-50, close to 50-50 election. One of them, of course, was to move the embassy to Jerusalem in violation of not only international law, but even Security Council resolutions that the U.S. had participated in. Very dramatic change. The second, equally dramatic, was to authorize Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights. The Syrian Golan Heights are, under international law, occupied territory. Israel, every major institution has, every relevant institution, Security Council, International Court of Justice, all agree on this. Israel did formally annex the Golan Heights, but the Security Council, UN Security Council, with the U.S. participating, declared that null and void. Okay, Trump unilaterally reversed it. Another gift to Netanyahu, saying, try to demonstrate to the Israeli public that with U.S. backing, he can get anything they want. The last was Trump's latest, just before the election, his declaration that if elected, he would annex parts of the West Bank. That was with tacit U.S. authorization. These are strong measures that were taken to interfere radically with a foreign election. Have you heard something about how terrible it is to interfere in foreign elections? I think maybe that you noticed that somewhere. Here it's done radically. It's considered fine. But exactly what are the actual consequences of that in terms of the way policy has been evolving? Fact of the matter is not much. So take the annexation of the Golan Heights. In fact, it was declared null and void by the Security Council. It was condemned by the International Court of Justice, but did anybody do anything about it? Has any move been made to prevent Israel's development of the Golan Heights? Establishment of settlements, enterprises, development of ski resorts on Mount Hermon, anything? No, nobody lifted a finger. And nobody lifted a finger for a simple reason. The U.S. won't allow it. Nobody says that, but that's the fact. Well, now it's formally authorized instead of just happening. Take the Netanyahu's proposal to annex parts of the West Bank. That's been going on for 50 years, literally. Right after the '67 war, both political parties, both major groupings in Israel, the former labor-based party, the Likud-based party, conglomerate, they have slightly different policies, but essentially they have been carrying out a development program in the West Bank which is geared towards the goal, the very clear goal of creating what will be a kind of greater Israel, in which Israel will take over whatever is of value in the West Bank, leave the Palestinian population concentrations like in Nablus and Tulkarm, leave them isolated. In the rest of the region, there are maybe 150 or so little Palestinian enclaves, more or less surrounded by checkpoints, often separated from their fields, able to survive, but barely. Meanwhile, Jewish settlements are developed. Cities have been constructed. Major city, Ma'ale Adumim, constructed mostly under Clinton, incidentally, under the Clinton years, east of Jerusalem. The road to it essentially bisects the West Bank. Further ones up north. Jerusalem itself is maybe 5 times the size of what it ever was historically. All of these are linked by highly developed infrastructure projects. You can take a trip. You can try. This is basically creating pleasant suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in the West Bank. You can travel from Ma'ale Adumim to Tel Aviv on a big highway restricted to Israelis and tourists, not Palestinians, more easily than you can get from the South Shore to Boston, never seeing an Arab. All of this has been steadily developed year after year with tacit U.S. support. U.S. provides the diplomatic support, a lot of the economic support, the military aid. Meanwhile, the government says, we don't like it, stop doing it, but providing the means for it. Well, the only difference in Netanyahu's statement with Trump's tacit backing is, I'm going to go ahead and annex all of this instead of just developing it subject to eventual annexation. These are the real things that have been happening. The Netanyahu victory, as I mentioned before, solidifies an alliance that has been developed. It's been parts of it have been kind of undercover for years, not formal, but functioning. Now coming into the open of the most reactionary Arab states, primarily Saudi Arabia, one of the most reactionary states in the world, Egypt under the Sisi dictatorship, the worst dictatorship in Egypt's history, United Arab Emirates, similar, Israel right in the center of it. It's part of the international right-wing alliance system, the international reactionary ultranationalist alliance system that's taking shape with the U.S. leadership, a kind of a new global system that's developing. South America's under Bolsonaro's another part of it.
And yet, in the United States, there's this growing awareness. For example, the Democratic-Republican vote against Saudi Arabia, UAE's war in Yemen, fueled by the United States. Does that give you hope?
That's very interesting development. That's actually Bernie Sanders. It's and notice, and it is a very important development, but let's notice what happened. The Saudi, the United Arab Emirates war in Yemen has been a hideous atrocity. There's probably, nobody knows, maybe 60, 70,000 people killed, half the population barely surviving. The UN describes it as the worst humanitarian disaster in the world. It's a real monstrosity. It's been going on year after year, using Saudi Arabia, UAE, are using U.S. weapons, secondarily British weapons, U.S. intelligence support, the U.S. intelligence directly working closely with the Saudis to target bombing, so on and so forth. All of this has been happening with no protest. Then came the Khashoggi killing, brutal killing of a journalist for the Washington Post. That caused outrage, okay? It should have, but, you know, that's not the reason why the Yemen war should have suddenly had the spotlight shined on it, but it was. Then Bernie Sanders came along with a couple of others and initiated the legislation which put some crimps in the direct U.S. support for the war, which is significant, but we should put it in the context of what in fact happened. And I think we can be pretty confident that the Trump-Pompeo-Bolton triumvirate will find a way around it, keep the war going, unless the public seriously protests.
Noam Chomsky, speaking at the Old South Church in Boston in April. We'll return to Professor Chomsky after a short break to talk about the Green New Deal and his take on Russian meddling in the 2016 elections.
Sola voy con mi pena, sola va mi condena. Correr es mi destino para burlar la ley, perdida en el corazón de la grande Babilón. Me dicen clandestino por no llevar papel. Pa' una ciudad del norte yo me fui a trabajar. Mi vida la dejé entre Tijuana y Bagdad. Soy una raya en el mar.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our special broadcast of an hour with the world-renowned linguist, political dissident Noam Chomsky, I spoke to him April 11th at the Old South Church in Boston. I asked Professor Chomsky to talk about the Green New Deal and the lessons of the Old New Deal.
First of all, I think the Green New Deal is exactly the right idea. You can raise questions about the specific form in which Ocasio-Cortez and Markey introduced it. Maybe it shouldn't be exactly this way, it should be a little bit differently. But the general idea is quite right. And there's very solid work explaining, developing in detail exactly how it could work. So a very fine economist at UMass Amherst, Robert Pollin, has written extensively on in extensive detail with close analysis of how you could implement policies of this kind in a very effective way, which would actually make a better society. It wouldn't be that you'd lose from it, you'd gain from it. The costs of renewable energy are declining very sharply. If you eliminate the massive subsidies that are given to fossil fuels, they probably already surpass them. There are many means that can be implemented and carried out to overcome, certainly to mitigate, maybe to overcome this serious crisis. So the basic idea is, I think, completely defensible, in fact, essential. A lot of the media commentary ridiculing this and that aspect of it are essentially beside the point. You can change the dates from 2030 to 2040. You can do a couple of other manipulations, but the basic idea is correct. Well, what's the difference from the 1930s? Several things. One thing that's different is large-scale labor action. The 1930s were the period of the organization of the CIO. In the 1920s, the U.S. labor movement had been virtually destroyed. Remember, this is very much a business-run society. American labor history is very violent, quite unlike comparable countries. And by the 1920s, the quite effective militant labor movement had been pretty much crushed. One of the great works of labor history by David Montgomery, one of the great labor historians, is called The Rise and Fall of the American Labor Movement. He was talking about the 1920s, when it had essentially been destroyed. The 1930s, it revived. It revived with large-scale organizing activities. CIO organizing began. The strike actions were quite militant. They led to sit-down strikes. A sit-down strike is a real sign of warning to the business classes, because there's a step beyond a sit-down strike. The next step beyond a sit-down strike is, let's start the factory running by ourselves. We don't need the bosses. We can run it ourselves. So get rid of them, okay? That's a real revolution, the kind that should take place. The participants in an enterprise would own and run it by themselves, instead of being the slaves of the private owners who control their lives. And a sit-down strike is a bare step away from that. That's aroused real fear among the ownership classes. Second element was there was a sympathetic administration, which is very critical. You look at the history of labor actions over the centuries. There's a very good book on this, incidentally, by Eric Loomis, who has a book called American History in 10 Strikes, or some similar name, where he runs through the militant labor actions ever since the early 19th century. And he makes an interesting point. He says, every successful labor action has had the support, at least tacit support, of the government. If the government and the ownership classes are unified in crushing labor action, they've always succeeded, okay? Very significant observation. And in the 1930s, there was a sympathetic administration for many reasons. But that combination of militant labor action, it was a very lively political period in many ways, and a sympathetic administration did lead to the New Deal, which greatly changed people's lives.
Can you share your analysis of President Trump? You have lived through so many presidents. Explain President Trump to us and assess the massive response to him.
Well, Trump is, I think there are a number of illusions about Trump. If you take a look at the Trump phenomenon, it's not very surprising. Think back for the last 10 or 15 years over Republican Party primaries, and remember what happened during the primaries. Each primary, when some candidate rose from the base, they were so outlandish that the Republican establishment tried to crush them and succeeded in doing it. Michelle Bachmann, Herman Cain, Rick Santorum, anyone who was coming out of the base was totally unacceptable to the establishment. The change in 2016 is they couldn't crush him. But the interesting question is, why was this happening? Why, in election after election, was the voting base producing a candidate utterly intolerable to the establishment? And the answer to that, if you think about that, the answer is not very hard to discover. Since the 1970s, during this neoliberal period, both of the political parties have shifted to the right. The Democrats, by the 1970s, pretty much abandoned the working class. In the last gasp of more or less progressive Democratic Party legislative proposals was the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act in 1978, which Carter watered down so that it had no teeth, just became voluntary. But the Democrats had pretty much abandoned the working class. They became pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. Meanwhile, the Republicans shifted so far to the right that they went completely off the spectrum. Two of the leading political analysts of the American Enterprise Institute, Thomas Mann, Norman Ornstein, about 5 or 10 years ago, described the Republican Party as what they called a radical insurgency that has abandoned parliamentary politics. Well, why did that happen? It happened because the Republicans face a difficult problem. They have a primary constituency, a real constituency, extreme wealth and corporate power. That's who they have to serve. That's their constituency. You can't get votes that way, so you have to do something else to get votes. What do you do to get votes? This was begun by Richard Nixon with the Southern strategy, try to pick up racists in the South. The mid-1970s, Paul Weyrich, one of the Republican strategists, hit on a brilliant idea. Northern Catholics voted Democratic, tended to vote Democratic, a lot of them working class. The Republicans could pick up that vote by pretending, crucially, pretending to be opposed to abortion. By the same pretense, they could pick up the evangelical vote. Those are big votes, evangelicals, Northern Catholics. Notice the word pretense is crucial. You go back to the 1960s, every leading Republican figure was strongly what we call now pro-choice. The Republican Party position was, that's Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, all the leadership. Their position was abortion is not the government's business. It's a private business. Government has nothing to say about it. They turned almost on a dime in order to try to pick up a voting base on what are called cultural issues. Same with gun rights. The gun rights become a matter of holy writ because you can pick up part of the population that way. In fact, what they've done is put together a coalition of voters based on issues that are basically tolerable to the establishment, but they don't like it. Okay, and they've got to hold those two constituencies together. The real constituency of wealth and corporate power, they're taken care of by the actual legislation. So if you look at the legislation under Trump, it's just lavish gifts to the wealth and the corporate sector. The tax bill, the deregulation, every case in point. That's kind of the job of Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, those guys. They serve the real constituency. Meanwhile, Trump has to maintain the voting constituency with one outrageous position after another that appeals to some sector of the voting base. And he's doing it very skillfully. It's just as a political manipulation, it's skillful. Work for the rich and the powerful, shaft everybody else, but get their votes. It's not an easy trick. and he's carrying it off, and I should say the Democrats are helping him. They are. Take the focus on Russiagate. What's that all about? I mean, it was pretty obvious at the beginning that you're not going to find anything very serious about Russian interference in elections. I mean, for one thing, it's undetectable. I mean, in the 2016 election, the Senate and the House went the same way as the executive, but nobody claims there was Russian interference there. In fact, Russian interference in the election, if it existed, was very slight. Much less, say, than interference by, say, Israel. Israel, the prime minister, Netanyahu, goes to Congress, talks to a joint session of Congress without even informing the White House to attack Obama's policies. I mean, that's dramatic interference with elections. Not whatever the Russians tried. It's not going to be anything like that. And in fact, there's no interference in elections that begins to compare with campaign funding. Remember that campaign funding alone gives you a very high prediction of electoral outcome. It's again Tom Ferguson's major work, which has shown this very persuasively. That's massive interference in elections. Anything the Russians might have done is going to be, peanuts and compared. As far as Trump collusion with the Russians, that was never going to amount to anything more than minor corruption. Maybe building a Trump hotel in Red Square or something like that, but nothing of any significance. The Democrats invested everything in this issue. Well, it turned out there was nothing much there. They gave Trump a huge gift. In fact, they may have handed him the next election. That's a matter of being so unwilling to deal with fundamental issues that they're looking for something on the side that'll somehow give political success. The real issues are different things. They're things like climate change, like global warming, like the nuclear posture review, deregulation. These are real issues, but the Democrats aren't going after those. They're looking for something else. The Democratic establishment. I'm not talking about the young cohort that's coming in, which is quite different. All of that has to be shifted significantly if there's going to be a legitimate political opposition to the right-wing drift that's taking place. And it can happen, can definitely happen, but it's going to take work.
Noam Chomsky speaking at the Old South Church in Boston in April. And that does it for the show. If you'd like to get a copy, go to DemocracyNow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Charina Nadura, Tamarie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ishmael Darrow, Vesta Godars, and Carl Marxer. And to our camera crew, John Randolph, Karen Meadows, Anna Osbeck, and Matt Ely. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.